Chapters 9, 10, and 11 share a theme of terrain, of talking about the earth and how it can be used in war to the general's advantage. There is pretty familiar territory in these chapters, so I'm not going to be spending as much time with it as I have with the previous chapters. One thing you might want to do is just to look at one of the passages. So towards the beginning of chapter 9, Sun Tzu writes, "If the enemy crosses a river toward you, do not confront him in midstream. Let half his troops cross before you strike." Considered somewhat allegorically, if you think about not only a physical river, but someone who's coming out into some sort of a situation which puts them in a great disadvantage. So the troops being midstream. If you go into that situation and confront them directly, then you're also at the same sort of disadvantage. So it's a sort of a ground where you need to realize the importance of timing, the importance of perhaps holding back for a second and letting your enemy commit to a movement. That would be one sort of way that you can begin to unpack this sort of a statement. So you're welcome within your assignment to continue to do this, to take a passage and then try to apply it to a real life situation. Welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 9 of the Art of War, entitled On the March. There's a lot of territory in this chapter which seems pretty familiar by now, and so I'm going to be skipping a lot of it. Excuse me. What I would like to do is to skip ahead to the section that begins, "If the trees move, he is coming." So I'll begin reading there and then give you some commentary. "If trees move, he is coming. If there are many screens in the grass, he wants to perplex us. Birds rising in flight are a sign of ambush. Beasts startled are a sign of a surprise attack. Dust high and peaking is a sign of chariots approaching. Dust low and spreading is a sign of infantry approaching. Dust in scattered strands is a sign of firewoods being collected. Dust in drifting pockets is a sign of an army encamping." What we see here is basically the earth speaking out against the enemy. And we remember that the earth is one of the fundamentals that the warrior has to master in order to understand the art of war, in order to sort of grasp all the changes and to be able to control the Tao of war. And here we see him using the earth itself to speak out against his enemy, to sort of read the signs of the earth. It's very powerful imagery. Similarly, we see how the troops themselves, how the actions of the troops, unbeknownst to them, can speak out regarding the disposition of the general or their own sort of inner psychology, so to speak. So I'll begin reading with light chariots. "Light chariots emerging first on the wings are a sign of battle formation. Words of peace, but no treaty, are a sign of a plot. Much running about and soldiers parading are a sign of expectation. Some men advancing and some retreating are a sign of a decoy. Soldiers standing bent on their spears indicate great hunger. Bearers of water drinking first indicate great thirst," and so forth. So again, what we have here is just like how we saw the dirt and the birds were sort of speaking about the enemy. Now we're going one level deeper in, and we're looking to see how the troops themselves can just one example of a small amount of the troops. So the water bearers, for example, can speak to the whole disposition of the troops. We can gather a great amount of information just by focusing on one or two of these soldiers and learning how to read them. Okay, we're moving on now to Chapter 10. Notice first that Chapter 10 is called Forms of Terrain, and Chapter 11, The 9 Kinds of Ground. So we see that there's some similarity in themes between Chapters 10 and 11. The commentators have sort of questioned whether we even need 11, if you look in the comments there. So just let yourselves know that we're going to see some territory a few times over and over again, if you'll pardon the pun. Okay, so the Chapter 10 opens up with telling us these 6 types of terrain. These are accessible, entangling, deadlock, enclosed, precipitous, and distant. And one thing we notice about each of these sorts of terrains is it lends itself, or it even necessitates, a different kind of warfare for each one of these. So accessible terrain has certain things that it's going to lend itself to, and certain things that are not going to be available for that sort of terrain. I don't think there's anything terribly mysterious going on here. It's Sun Tzu being very matter of fact as far as dealing with terrain specifically. That doesn't mean that we can't open up what he means by these sorts of terrain into a more metaphorical usage again. So what is an enclosed terrain if we're talking about fighting with your partner, or trying to broker some sort of a business merger, or trying to finagle an A out of your teacher or something like that. So you can always sort of open up these sorts of terrains into different sorts of understanding. Next, he moves on to the 6 forms of defeat. These are flight, impotence, decay, collapse, chaos, and rout. And one thing that we can notice about this is the fact that almost all of these have to do with some sort of a disconnect between the general and the soldiers. We've seen a few times that Sun Tzu thinks that the general is supposed to be able to take care of all these sorts of problems between soldiers, that discipline is one of the main abilities of a general, and this is sort of showing that you possess the Tao. If you can sort of take the different passions, the different desires of all of your troops, and sort of work these into a harmonious whole, and then get these soldiers to accomplish your will, then this is having the Tao of warfare. This is knowing how to go about this. Next, I wanted to make note of a shift in tone within the art of war, and also where we start to see a different side of this general that Sun Tzu has been speaking of. So he writes, "He who advances without seeking fame, who retreats without escaping blame, he whose one aim is to protect his people and serve his lord, this man is a jewel of the realm. He regards his troops as his children, and they will go with him into the deepest ravine. He regards them as his loved ones, and they will stand by him unto death." So here we see a general who has so much confidence that he doesn't need fame, and he has so much courage that he's not afraid of being blamed for something. It's interesting that now we see this talk about him being affectionate, having affection for his troops. They're no longer just considered pawns who have to be disciplined, like in chapter 1, but they're not compared with rocks anymore, like was the case in chapter 5. And instead they're called beloved, and they're called his children. So this is a different, more affectionate, more kind of ethical relationship that we see the general having with his troops. Of course, this is Sun Tzu, so we can always say that anytime we do show this sort of affection towards troops, there's something that we can get out of it. So if the troops think that they are loved, if the troops think that they're being cared for, then they're going to be more likely to, as he says, stand with him until death. So they're willing to sort of go into this death ground with you and fight to the bitter end if they think that if they have this sort of a familial bond with you.